The official report from the National Transportation Safety Board is chillingly clear. The pilots of Lion Air Flight 610 had no idea what was fighting them for control of their own aircraft. For 11 minutes, two experienced captains battled a brand new, state-of-the-art Boeing 737 MAX that seemed determined to fly itself into the sea. They were pulling back on the yoke with all their strength, but an invisible force kept pushing the nose of the plane down again and again. 13 minutes after takeoff, the fight was over. 5 months later, the exact same scenario played out in the skies over Ethiopia. Another brand new 737 MAX, another crew fighting an aircraft that refused to obey, another 157 lives extinguished. In total, 346 people were dead. The world demanded to know what went wrong with the machine. But that is the wrong question. This wasn't a story about a series of technical malfunctions. This was the story of a financial crime hidden in plain sight, with the victims falling from 30,000 feet. The fatal flaw wasn't a faulty wire or a broken sensor. It was a deliberate choice made in a boardroom to conceal a powerful and aggressive flight control system from the very pilots who needed to know about it most. At its core, the architecture of this tragedy was designed to protect one thing: shareholder value. To save money, to avoid costly pilot retraining, and to rush a plane to market to compete with their rival, Airbus. A decision was made that a piece of software was more important than the pilot's authority, and that its existence should be kept secret. We think of plane crashes as engineering failures. But what if the system worked exactly as it was designed? What if the deaths of 346 people were not an accident, but the calculated cost of doing business? Why did two crews of highly trained pilots seem to lose complete control of their aircraft? To find the answer, you have to unravel the lie. To understand the decision, you have to understand the numbers. And the numbers were screaming. The Boeing 737 had been the company's cash cow for decades, a reliable workhorse of the skies. But by the 2010s, its biggest rival, Airbus, had a killer new product: the A320neo. It was more fuel efficient, and airlines were ordering it by the thousands. Boeing was losing its grip on the single-aisle market, a market worth trillions. They were cornered. So they made a choice. Designing a brand new plane from scratch would cost tens of billions and take a decade. Modifying the existing 737 airframe, however, would be exponentially cheaper and faster. More importantly, it would allow them to market the new plane, the 737 MAX, as just another 737, letting airlines avoid spending millions on expensive new pilot training and simulators. This was the masterstroke, the key to the entire financial equation. The architecture of this plan was built on a foundation of pure financial calculus. In the years leading up to the crashes, Boeing's leadership funneled over $43 billion into stock buybacks. That's not profit sharing or research and development. It's a direct injection of cash to inflate the company's own stock price. To put that number in perspective, $43 billion is more than the entire annual economic output of countries like Bolivia or Paraguay. It's a staggering sum dedicated not to building better planes, but to engineering a better stock ticker. The pressure from Wall Street was immense, and the new culture taking hold inside the company was one where financial targets were not just a priority, they were the only priority. In this new version of Boeing, it seems that safety became an optional extra. This wasn't the Boeing that built the 747, the company whose engineering helped put a man on the moon. This was something different. A ghost in the machine driven by a logic that prized quarterly earnings reports over aeronautical integrity. At its core, a rot had set in, a cultural decay that began long before the first bolt was fastened onto the first 737 MAX. So what fundamentally changed inside Boeing, a company once revered as the gold standard of aviation engineering? And how exactly does a corporate philosophy, born in a boardroom, translate into a fatal, irreversible dive just minutes after takeoff? The problem was pure physics. To compete with the A320neo, Boeing had to bolt larger, more fuel-efficient engines onto an airframe designed 50 years prior. But the 737's low ground clearance meant those engines had to be mounted further forward and higher on the wing. The single design choice created a catastrophic aerodynamic flaw, a dangerous tendency for the plane's nose to pitch up, risking a stall. The engineers needed a fix. The executives needed a fix that was invisible to pilots and regulators. Their solution was a piece of software, a secret flight control system called the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, MCAS. According to Boeing, this system was trivial. An internal training document stated it operates without pilot knowledge. They insisted it was just a minor background function, a simple extension of existing controls. But this is the villain denial paradox in action. If it was so insignificant, why was it powerful enough to overpower two seasoned airline captains? If it was just a routine software update, why was its very existence deliberately scrubbed from the flight manuals? The architecture of the entire MAX program hinged on this one deception. How do you convince the world you're selling the same old 737 when you've secretly installed a powerful new system with the authority to fly the plane into the ground? You don't just hide a system like MCAS. You build a fortress of plausible deniability around it. The first brick in that wall was a catastrophic design choice, making this aggressive software rely on a single non-redundant sensor. This sensor is called an angle of attack, or AOA, vane. Think of it as a tiny weather vane on the fuselage that tells the flight computers how the plane's nose is angled against the oncoming air. In decades of aviation design, the golden rule is redundancy. Critical systems always have a backup, and a backup for the backup. But MCAS had none. If that one single AOA vane was damaged or failed, a common occurrence, the system would be fed garbage data and react with lethal, automated force. The architecture of this failure goes deeper. According to a U.S. House Committee report, Boeing designed a warning light, an angle of attack disagree alert, that would have instantly told the pilots their AOA sensors were giving conflicting data. This alert was a vital diagnostic tool. But on the 737 MAX, it was sold as an optional extra. It was an add-on, a feature you had to pay for. The planes that crashed didn't have it activated. At its core, this was the moment the philosophy became policy. Safety became an optional extra. This practice of unbundling critical instruments created what insiders knew was a flawed machine. We know this because of Boeing's own internal communications released during congressional investigations. One employee described the MAX as a plane designed by clowns, who in turn are supervised by monkeys. Another admitted they wouldn't put their own family on it. It wasn't a secret. The Department of Justice would later charge Boeing with conspiracy to defraud the FAA, a charge the company paid $2.5 billion to settle. This wasn't a tragic accident. It was a documented, internally mocked, and legally prosecuted deception. What kind of person builds something like this? What kind of culture not only allows it but rewards it? A corporation is not a person, but it does have a soul. And for most of the 20th century, Boeing's soul lived on the factory floors and in the design labs of Seattle. It was a culture built by engineers for engineers. Men with slide rules and dreams of pushing the boundaries of physics. They gave the world the 707, which kickstarted the jet age, and the 747, the queen of the skies. A plane so audacious, so impossibly large, that its own factory had to be the biggest building by volume ever constructed. In this world, the engineers were kings. Their authority was absolute because their calculations were a matter of life and death. The numbers that mattered weren't on a stock ticker, they were on a blueprint. Failure was not an option because failure meant a smoking crater in the ground. This was the Boeing that became an icon of American innovation, a symbol of doing impossible things correctly. But on the other side of the country, in St. Louis, a different kind of company was operating. McDonnell Douglas was a defense contractor, a master of government contracts and brutal efficiency. They were run not by engineers, but by executives laser-focused on the bottom line. Their most famous leader, Harry Stoncypher, was a disciple of Jack Welch's cut and slash school of management at GE. Their religion was shareholder value. In 1997, the unthinkable happened. Boeing, the giant, acquired its struggling rival. On paper, it was a victory. In reality, as one insider famously quipped, it was a reverse takeover. McDonnell Douglas bought Boeing with Boeing's money. The soul of the St. Louis company, the ruthless focus on financial metrics, began to migrate west. The culture clash was immediate and catastrophic. The engineers in Seattle, who were used to designing for perfection, were now told to design for cost. The meticulous, slow, and expensive process of building the world's safest aircraft was now seen as a drag on quarterly earnings. The bean counters, as the engineers called them, were in charge. Then came the symbolic final blow. In 2001, Boeing's corporate headquarters was moved from its engineering heartland in Seattle to a skyscraper in Chicago, far from the noise of the factory floor. The message was unmistakable. The financial architecture of the company was now more important than its physical engineering. The fallout from this decision was a quiet, creeping decay. Veteran engineers, who saw their warnings about cost-cutting ignored, began to leave. In their place came a new generation of managers, fluent in the language of stock buybacks and efficiency reports. As one longtime Boeing engineer, Dr. L.J. Hart-Smith, wrote in a devastating internal paper, the new leadership had created a business model that is focused on short-term financial performance rather than long-term engineering excellence. A house of cards was being built where the stock price was propped up by starving the very innovation that made Boeing great. This was the rebirth. A new Boeing emerged from the ashes of the old. It looked the same from the outside, but its internal DNA was fundamentally altered. This new entity was leaner, more aggressive, and spectacularly profitable. It was a Wall Street darling. This was the company that, when faced with the threat of the Airbus A320neo, would not see an engineering challenge, but a financial problem to be solved as quickly and cheaply as possible. It was a company that had perfected the art of managing its numbers. And, as investigators would soon discover, it had also become ruthlessly effective at managing its government regulator. At its core, the new Boeing had learned that the path of least resistance wasn't through the wind tunnel, but through the halls of the FAA. So, how do you get a deeply flawed aircraft with a secret piece of lethal software certified as safe to fly? You get a flawed aircraft certified by making sure the flaw is invisible. Not just to the pilots, but to the regulator itself. This wasn't about outsmarting the FAA with brilliant engineering. It was about outmaneuvering them with strategic deception. And at the heart of that strategy was MCAS. We've established what it is. Now let's unravel what they told the world it was. Boeing's own documents submitted to the FAA described MCAS as a system that could only move the plane's horizontal stabilizer by 0.6 degrees, a tiny, almost imperceptible nudge. But the final version installed on the 737 MAX could move it by 2.5 degrees, over 4 times more powerful. 4 times the authority to push the nose of the plane towards the ground. This change was never communicated to the FAA. Why? Because the more powerful the system, the more likely it would trigger the one thing Boeing's entire financial model was designed to avoid: a requirement for expensive and time-consuming pilot simulator training. This is the layered reveal of the crime. You thought the system was just a secret? No, its power was deliberately and drastically understated. You thought the pilots were just unprepared? No, they were ambushed by a system that was orders of magnitude more aggressive than the one certified by the regulator. This is how 2 crews of highly trained pilots lost complete control. They weren't fighting a malfunction. They were fighting a ghost in the machine, a ghost programmed with 4 times the strength they could have ever anticipated, a ghost they were never told existed. The architecture of this deception was built to be impenetrable. And the final, most cynical layer of that architecture was the monetization of the truth. Remember that angle of attack disagree alert? The simple warning light that would have told the pilots their sensors were failing, the very trigger for the MCAS catastrophe. Boeing's engineers had built it. It existed in the software. But according to the U.S. House Committee report, a decision was made to bundle it with a separate, paid software package. The warning light was turned off by default. To turn it on, airlines had to pay Boeing more money. Let that sink in. A company builds a system that relies on a single vulnerable sensor. It knows this sensor can fail, and it then sells the warning light for that failure as an optional upgrade. This is the logic of a mobile app asking you to pay 99 cents to unlock a premium feature. Except here, the feature was a fundamental safety alert, and the price of not having it was 346 lives. At its core, this is the moment the philosophy becomes undeniable fact. Safety became an optional extra. The system was working. Stock was rising. The CEO, Dennis Muilenburg, was paid $30 million in 2018, the year of the first crash. The fallout was not just tragic, it was criminal. The Department of Justice charged Boeing not with a safety violation, but with conspiracy to defraud the Federal Aviation Administration. The company signed a deferred prosecution agreement and paid a fine of over $2.5 billion. It sounds like a massive number, but for a company that generated over $100 billion in revenue in 2018, it's a rounding error. It was the calculated cost of doing business. It was a fine, not a conviction. No executive went to jail. And that leaves one final, terrifying question. Boeing built a house of cards on a foundation of lies. But who was supposed to be inspecting the foundation? Where was the one agency whose entire purpose is to prevent a catastrophe like this from ever happening? So where was the Watchdog? Where was the Federal Aviation Administration? The truth is, they were largely absent by design. Years of budget cuts and a shift in philosophy had led to a program called Organization Designation Authorization, or ODA. At its core, it was a system of self-regulation. The FAA effectively outsourced vast portions of the MAX safety certification back to Boeing. Boeing employees paid by Boeing were tasked with signing off on Boeing's own work. This wasn't necessarily a story of bribes and backroom deals. It was something more insidious: regulatory capture. The agency meant to police the industry had become its partner. It was outgunned, under-resourced, and had placed its trust in a company that no longer deserved it. The architecture of this failure wasn't just inside the plane. It was embedded in the very system meant to keep us safe. The Watchdog wasn't just asleep. It had been put on a leash held by the company it was supposed to be watching. The fallout was a 20-month global grounding of the entire 737 MAX fleet, a public humiliation for an American icon. And that $2.5 billion settlement with the Department of Justice for conspiracy to defraud the FAA? It was carefully structured as a deferred prosecution agreement. This meant that, as long as Boeing behaved, the company, the corporate entity, would never have to plead guilty to the felony. No executive ever faced criminal charges. Not one. The system that created the problem protected the people who presided over it. For the families of the 346 victims, this wasn't just a failure of justice. It was a profound betrayal. And this is where the story unravels into a much darker and more uncomfortable question. A question that goes far beyond a single airplane. Was the Boeing 737 MAX disaster the result of a few greedy executives? Or was it the logical, predictable outcome of the entire system we've built? This is a debate about the very soul of modern capitalism, a conflict known as shareholder primacy. For decades, it's been the dominant, legally defended belief in American business that a company's one and only social responsibility is to increase its profits and maximize returns for its shareholders. Everything else, the welfare of its employees, the quality of its products, the safety of its customers, is secondary. From this perspective, the choices that led to 346 deaths become chillingly rational. A full redesign would have crushed the stock price. Admitting to MCAS true power would have triggered costly training, hurting sales. Making a safety alert standard would have been leaving money on the table. The executives weren't breaking the rules of the game. They were playing it exactly as it's meant to be played. They were, in the strictest legal sense, doing their jobs. But that cannot be the end of the story, because a legal obligation to a shareholder does not grant a moral license to build a flawed machine and lie about it. Thousands of engineers and managers worked on this plane. At any point, someone could have put their foot down. The documents prove they knew. This airplane is designed by clowns, one wrote. They knew, and yet the assembly line kept moving. A culture of fear. Fear of missing a deadline, of hurting the stock price, of being the one who cost the company billions, overrode a culture of safety. That is not a system. That is a series of human choices. And so we are left with the final terrifying question. In a system that legally obligates corporate leadership to prioritize shareholder returns, was the 737 MAX disaster a preventable crime, or was it a terrifying inevitability? The answer to that question is not in the past. It's being debated right now in boardrooms, in engineering bays, and in the halls of government. And the conclusion we come to will define the safety of the technology that surrounds us all. It forces us to ask what we value more, the numbers on a balance sheet or the lives of human beings. Because the ghost in the machine wasn't a piece of software. It was a set of priorities, and it's still in there. The 737 MAX showed how corporate greed can have deadly consequences. But that was just one company. In our next video, we expose a single hedge fund whose reckless gamble threatened to bankrupt nations and collapse the entire system. To see how close we came, subscribe and follow our investigations.